Welcome back. We are entering Chapter 2, Perception and Consciousness, the basics of information intake. All right, so the first thing we need to discuss is what the word sensation means versus what the word perception means. A lot of times it seems like the two topics are really the same because they cover the same sensory organs. So we're talking about vision and hearing and smelling and tasting and touch. And so it seems like we're talking about the same thing, but we're really not. Sensation is talking about how our actual sense receptors collect information. So if you were to take a class called sensation, in that class, we would talk about how the eyeballs actually collect light information and send it up to the brain. How the ears actually collect information, sound waves, and transmit that up to the brain, and so on. So in a sensation class, there's a lot of biology, right? Like how exactly these sense receptors transfer information from the outside world and conduct it up to the brain in a way that the brain then will be able to interpret. So sensation is very much a biological process. It is when you take a class on sensation, it feels very much like you're taking a biology class rather than a psychology class. Sensation is an example of what we call bottom-up processing. This is something that you're going to be hearing throughout class. So it's good to know sort of at the very beginning what bottom-up processing refers to. It means that the process is data-driven, that it's basically using information from the stimulus itself in order to do its job. So in bottom-up processing, we're using the elements that are actually present in the stimulus. And that's it, just whatever's in the stimulus. Perception, on the other hand, is how our brain interprets the information that's collected through sensation. For a lot of people who are psychologists, perception seems like the psychology topic, not sensation. Both things are actually psychology topics, but the topic of perception fits most people's expectations for what a psychology class would sound like, because in perception we talk about, well, how does the brain understand what has come in through the sense organs? This is a much more cognitive process. There's a lot more that sounds like what you would expect to see in a cognitive psychology class. It's what we call a top-down process. And what that means is that instead of relying on the data that's inherent in the stimulus, instead, the processing is going to be driven by concepts. So things that you already have in your head are going to help you to interpret what is coming up from the sensory organs. So top-down processes are based on knowledge. They're based on your expectations. Maybe those expectations have been shaped by the context that you're in, right? So you're not just collecting the raw data from the stimulus. Instead, you're using what you already know or what you already expect to help you to figure out what the stimulus really is. So perception is that part where you understand. Sensation is the mere collecting of the information. So I think it makes a lot of sense to share an example, and that'll really help to delineate sensation from perception. So you're looking at this black and white, like really overexposed photograph, and sensation is collecting the information about the black and white spots. So your eyes are collecting the light waves that are associated with the different parts of the picture and sending that information up to your brain. Perception is the part of your brain that is saying, what is that? And trying to figure out what is in this picture. Anything that looks familiar, anything that looks like something you've seen before that would help you to interpret this picture. So generally in class, I like to ask students, what are you seeing? Does anybody have any guesses about what this is a picture of? Things like that. So we'll just pretend like you're having those thoughts in your head, and obviously we can't share and guess, but then I reveal this nice colorized version where I used paint to fill in some of the details and draw some lines. So it's all very rough using my mouse pad, but now it's super obvious that that's a Dalmatian dog sniffing the ground walking on a sidewalk, the green grass around them, and the shade from the tree in front of them. Now that you've, see some of it colorized, the perception is super easy. You're no longer struggling trying to figure out just based on the black and white splotches. You instead can match this scene to things that you've seen before and understand what exactly you're experiencing. Your brain doesn't like it when information comes up from sensation and the brain can't find any clues to help it to determine what that stimulus really is. It's almost painful to us to be looking at or hearing or smelling or tasting something or feeling something with our touch receptors and thinking, what is that? What is that? Like, nothing is helping me to figure this out. I can't figure it out. It just really, it's almost painful to us to not be able to go directly from sensation to perception. You've probably all had experiences. Well, hopefully this black and white image was sort of one of those experiences where you felt like, gosh, I should be able to figure this out. I should be able to do this. It's super frustrating to be in that circumstance. All right, now we're going to do a little demonstration, which again, I like to do this in class and people shout out their answers, but you can just, shout them to yourself. So we have the field of psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. All right. So your question is, how many F's were in that passage? And I don't know why it disappears. How many F's are in that passage? And I make it a little easier for you and say that it's somewhere between 4 and 8. So how many F's between 4 and 8 are in this passage? The field of cognitive psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. Well, the answer is 7, and then I highlighted them in this version. And what I find is that a lot of times people will get 5, and it's because they ignored the F's that are in the words of, which it appears twice in this passage. Sometimes people will say 6, and interestingly, they will have left out the F's that are in the words of, but added the F in the word phenomena, which is actually a PH, but the F sound gets counted. So sometimes people will say 6. The thing is that our brains perceive this passage as having F sounds that aren't necessarily associated with actually the letter F, and will leave out F's that don't sound like F's, right? Like, your brain is trying to make sense of things. Your brain is trying to understand and to perceive the environment all the time. All right, let's do another little demonstration. I'm going to turn on my desktop sound so that you'll be able to hear this, and then we'll come back in a second and I'll tell you what I want you to do. So just listen to this little audio file and try and understand what it's saying. Okay, so just listen to the audio file.
Cogitate, 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 cogitate.
So typically I ask students now to write down anything that they heard. So if you want to play along with that, you can pause me. Writing down any words that you can come up with. And then I ask students to read their list. And oftentimes I have students writing down things like God is great, behind the 8, a whole bunch of different phrases, when in fact that file contains just the word cogitate repeated over and over and over again. Our brain wants to find the patterns that are present out in the world and make sense out of the information that's out in the world. So your brain is always trying to figure out, what's going on. So the function of pattern recognition is to make sense of stimulation. Your brain is trying to make sense of the world. It's trying to make sense of the sounds, the smells, the sights, and all those things that are coming in through sensation. Pattern recognition serves the function of helping us to impose meaning on what might be meaningless or maybe ambiguous stimulation. Sometimes information comes to us and it doesn't make any sense, and maybe it's not supposed to make sense. Maybe it's the sound of rain falling and collecting in your rain gutter, and it really doesn't have a pattern to it, but our brain perceives a pattern anyway, right? It's making a song out of it, or it's making some kind of rhythm out of it or something. Our brain likes to impose meaning and structure on what might be meaningless and structureless information. So information out in the world lands in our sensory register. This should look familiar from our last chapter because we talked about the Atkinson and Shiffrin model for memory. And that first box in the model is the sensory register, where information lands in your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, all that. Information that's in the sensory register is held long enough for our brains to try and impose some kind of pattern on it so that then our brain can recognize the stimulus. So sometimes the pattern that's imposed is a logical pattern. Like, for example, if you're looking at the words on this slide, your brain is recognizing the pattern of these different letters. Even though they're in a font that, may vary or differ from like handwriting or other fonts that you might see, your brain is looking for the pattern of, organization of letters. And that allows your brain to make sense of these little lines and squiggles that are on the screen. In pattern recognition, we match the current stimulus to existing long-term memories so that we can try and figure out, is this something that I know? Is this something I've seen before? Is it something that I'm familiar with? So that instead of having to construct our understanding from the ground up, we can, sort of say, okay, yeah, no, I've seen something like this before, or I've seen this exact thing before, and that simplifies our understanding.